Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to the Crossway podcast. My name is Josh, and today I am joined by a very special guest, Dr. Sean McDowell. Sean, thanks so much for being here with me.
Oh, happy to be here, Josh.
So for those of you who don't know, Sean, you're the Associate Professor of Apologetics at Biola University, is that right?
That's correct. I teach one undergrad class, but my full-time job is teaching graduate classes. We have an MA program in apologetics at Biola, technically Talbot School of Theology.
Awesome. So I've got Sean on the podcast today because obviously 2020 has sort of been a crazy year, both because of COVID, but also just sort of the cultural climate and politics and all of the tensions that have been brought out because of all of that stuff. And some of that is unique to 2020. Some of it is not. Some of it's been something we've been dealing with for a long time. And so Sean and I would like, Sean, I would like to discuss with you and maybe evaluate some of the stuff going on in our culture and how we as Christians can respond to and interact with that stuff. So let me just start by asking you, what's your evaluation of the culture? Because I know you used to do a lot of speaking, especially pre-COVID. You've done a lot of speaking on college campuses, at churches, different events like that. So what's your evaluation of the current culture? And what do you think the major problems are that we as Christians have in engaging and dialoguing with the culture?
If I had to capture what's going on in our culture, obviously there's always good and there's bad. There's redemptive themes and there's areas of concern. So I'm always cautious to blanket as a whole, but I see some larger trends where increasingly we're in what I would call a post-Christian and in some ways anti-Christian culture. Now, what I don't mean is there was this golden age in the 50s where everybody was Christian and read the Bible and followed. That's not what I mean. Clearly, that wasn't the case. But I mean, as a whole, our culture, you at least to agree with and celebrate Christian ideals and virtues as a whole, sometimes on the surface. Now, if you take biblical teaching seriously and you really believe it, in the eyes of many, and increasingly with millennials and Gen Zers, that's bigoted, that's homophobic, and that's intolerant. So Christianity is not only irrelevant, in the eyes of many people, it's actually become dangerous, especially when you talk about issues of sexual morality. So as a result, I think what many Christians are doing is we're taking our cues much more from the culture than we are from Scripture. And I could talk about this in particular with young people, which you mentioned is kind of my heartbeat. But I think studies show, and my personal experience would weigh in, that as a whole, I think the church is pretty deeply influenced by a secular mindset.
So identifying that then, because something I've noticed a lot, I think, when Christians attempt to, or maybe not attempt to, interact with the culture is a sort of, what do you think motivates that you just, the problem that you just described? Because my assessment would almost be it's something akin to maybe fear of, I don't know, either being rejected by the culture or maybe fear of not knowing how to handle or interact with those things. Does that sound right to you? And if so, what do you think are some of the steps that need to be taken in order to sort of start to get beyond that fear?
I think that it's motivated by fear. I think it's a fear. What if somebody asks me a question I can't answer? It's a fear of I don't want to be viewed as a bigot. It's a fear increasingly in more and more jobs that people have that you're being forced to go through certain kind of trainings and see the world that Christians are like, if I really say what I believe and live it out, could I lose my job? Like there's an underlying fear amongst a lot of Christians. And what I think the Bible responds directly to that. It's 1 John 4:18 that says perfect love casts out fear. So fear is a selfish motivation. I'm concerned about myself and what happens to me. Love is other focused. So if we'd ask the question, say, what does it mean to love? Mean to live out in a loving fashion in our culture right now? That's a very different question. And I think the other issue that I see is I think sometimes we get so caught up in these national mega stories that we don't just ask, what does it actually mean to love my neighbor who's next to me? Because I found most people, I mean, we have people of all political persuasions in the neighborhood in which we live. We had people put out Trump signs. We had people put out Biden signs, and just as passionate on both sides. And you know what? Both of them, if we treat them kindly and we're good neighbors, they're willing to have a relationship with us. So I think sometimes we just look at this 30,000 foot view culture war battle that's going on, and we miss like, okay, what does it mean to love my neighbors and be kind to the people that are around us? That's so much more doable for people, because sometimes I look at even political issues and I think I've got a platform and I can't do anything to stop how some people would feel more hopeless. Like, what can they do? Well, what we can do is we can better parent our kids. We can better love our neighbors. We can do better as Christians at work. Those things are doable, and I think that's where we start.
Yeah, that sounds great, and I think you're exactly right. So what? I don't mean to put you on the spot and like only want to seem like I'm making you assess the negative, but what do you think especially in everything that you just said, what do you think the biggest mistakes that Christians make when we try to engage, or those of, even if we're doing it maybe sincerely or out of a genuine concern for people, but maybe we just make some missteps or we don't treat situations. What do you think the most common mishandling of certain situations and interacting with maybe a skeptic or a non-believer or something is?
First off, I don't mind if you put me on the spot. That's what I do for a living all day. I get put on the spot and I'm used to it. And as strange as it sounds, I kind of enjoy it. I think Christians make one of two mistakes today. I think we either feel like, well, maybe the loving thing to do is to soften or compromise biblical truth. Maybe the culture has a better understanding of love, and I can find passages that fit the narrative I want about love and ignore the other ones. On the flip side, other people say, you know what? I got biblical truth, and it's not my job to care about your feelings. I'm going to speak truth because truth brings freedom, but they do it without love. The biblical balance is always truth and love together. It's not one or the other, it's both. Jesus came in grace and he came in truth. In 1 Thessalonians 1:9, I believe it is, Paul says, we not only gave you the gospel, which is truth, but we gave you our very own lives, which is relationship. So I think as a whole, I see Christians making one of those two mistakes.
Yeah, that's very good. So something that I am super passionate about and have brought up on this podcast a whole lot, and I think it's related to our ability to be able to interact and also to love, is the value of actually knowing what you're talking about when you go into engaging in conversations with people. And by that, I guess I'm referring to apologetics and the value of apologetics in our conversations with people in the culture. Obviously, there's sort of two sides to this. There's the actual content of the message that we have as Christians, and then there's the method of how we present that content. So what do you think the value of apologetics is in this sort of conversation between us as Christians and the culture? And maybe just for people who might not even know what that is, just sort of define apologetics for us and relate it to what we're talking about.
In 1 Peter 3:15, it says, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer for the hope within. Give it with gentleness and give it with respect. The word translated into answer or reason in the Greek is apologia, and it has this legal sense of being ready with an answer to make a case for why you believe what you believe. That's apologetics. And by the way, it's not a spiritual gift for pastors or for Bible teachers or podcasters or authors or debaters. It's actually all Christians are called to be ready with an answer for the hope within. Now, the reason I don't think we often engage skeptics is because we're afraid they'll ask us questions that we don't know. We don't want to be embarrassed, humiliated, ashamed. We don't want to fail. So we just choose not to engage at all. And I think that's a mistake. Now, one of my favorite presentations to do, Josh, is I put these glasses on and I role play an atheist. I've done this at churches and conferences. I mean, probably hundreds of times, and audiences know that I'm role playing an atheist. And I take questions, I respond as an atheist would. After about 15 to 20 minutes, when I respond more smartly than they expect an atheist to, you sense this frustration and sometimes anger from the audience. And when I'm done, I step out of character. I've had people yell at me. I've had people call me names, and they know I'm role playing. I'll step out of character and I'll say, use words to describe how you think you treated your atheist guest. And the most common words are just like hostile, ungracious, mean, uncharitable. Like there's some people who try to be kind, but you see this frustration come out. And my question is why? And I think one of the biggest reasons is if we don't know what we believe and why, and somebody presses us, it's human nature to get defensive. We get defensive. But when we know what we're talking about, and we've thought about, why do I believe God is good? Why do I think the Bible's true? Why do I think Jesus actually rose from the dead? What do I think about evolution? Well, then I'm less threatened when somebody asks me questions because I've come to a reasonable conclusion about it. So really, one of the main goals of apologetics is just to give Christians the confidence to engage non-believers and to do so without being defensive. And then when unbelievers have questions, apologetics is just a ministry of removing barriers so somebody can understand the gospel and see Jesus for who it is. It's not arguing with people. Anyone who does that is not being faithful to what Scripture says. By the way, let me phrase it this way. We are supposed to make arguments, but we're not supposed to be argumentative.
Yeah.
That's a very, very different thing.
Yeah, I like that distinction because I think, well, because it's so easy to sort of just take the word argument and see it through whatever lens. And even culturally, the word argument is something that is typically used to mean something, some point of, maybe rough-headedness or something like that, whereas we're just butting heads for the sake of butting heads, or pride or something like that. But yeah, I think that distinction is crucial, what you just said. Do you have, just off the top of your head, any sort of recommended resources that maybe somebody who's never even thought about giving a reasoned answer or response for the things that they believe to check out and maybe start to dig into that a little deeper?
Josh, you're throwing me a serious softball here, and I know that you know that because this is what I do and what I write. But I'll tell you one that I think would be great to start with is your audience might recognize my father's name, Josh McDowell, and he's been doing apologetics. He's in his 6th decade, and he was a skeptic trying to disprove Christianity back in the 50s and 60s, before you could Google things and before there were any apologetics books. Travels to Europe to go to museums and archaeological digs and all this kind of stuff, libraries, ends up becoming a Christian because of the evidence. Wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict in 1972 and just became a runaway bestseller. Well, he updated in the 80s, updated in the 90s, and just 3 years ago, we updated it together. So it's still called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. But I tell you what's interesting about this is I asked my dad, I said, Dad, you've been doing this a long time. My dad's 81, and he's still healthy and doing great. I said, how has the evidence for Christianity changed since when you started this, like in the middle of the last century? And he goes, son, there's a tsunami of evidence. He goes, I never dreamed there'd be these archaeological finds, manuscript finds, new arguments for the resurrection. It never dreamed that it would be so powerful. And there was enough to convince me in the middle of the 1900s. So if you're looking for one book for believers, it's thick, but often tell people just like 10, 15 minutes a day, and you would be amazed over time. You'd build up a confidence to answer these tough questions. It's very readable, and it's just called Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Well, awesome. So make sure if you are interested in starting to get your feet wet in some of these apologetic resources, start there. Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And also, you can go back and watch a couple of podcasts from the past. I have made some recommendations for you there, so go and check those out there. You can find those on our website or on our YouTube channel. So, Sean, when you were talking earlier about sort of our attitude and the little interactive testing that you do as when you put on the glasses and act like an atheist, and then you said sort of the expression of a lot of people's attitudes to that was one of hostility. I was reminded of the verse in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about his mode and his method of sharing the gospel, and he's talking about his rights and freedom that he has as a Christian, but he mentions his chameleon-like approach to presenting the gospel, where he said in 1 Corinthians 9, where ultimately he says, "I become all things to all people, so that I might win some." Thinking about our approach and how important that is in our interaction with the culture, how do you have any tips or advice on how to identify and ride that line between not compromising the truth, but also adapting our method in such a way that the gospel is received most effectively, that people are receptive to hearing the gospel?
Josh, I love this question. I got to be honest with you. I don't have an easy answer for you. And I've been thinking about this because last week somebody wrote an extensive post critiquing me on a short video I did on whether or not it's morally permissible to use a preferred gender pronoun, which is clearly a hot topic today.
Right.
And I basically said, you know what? Here's the arguments for somebody wants to build a relationship, show charity, respect. Here's the arguments against. Some people feel like you are contributing to a false reality and being forced to affirm something they don't think is true. I said, I don't have a simple answer for you. You need to think about both sides and act according to your conscience before the Lord. To me, that's not a black and white issue like, other issues are clearly laid out in Scripture. And Christians are going to differ on it. And so he critiqued me. I wrote as gracious of a response as I could. And the point was like, you know what? If you're in relationship with somebody and you feel like you can make it clear that you're not affirming transgender ideology, and it's clear in your heart where you're at and why you would use a certain pronoun with an individual for the sake of being in relationship, I'm not going to condemn that as being wrong. On the flip side, if someone says, gosh, I can't on my heart before the Lord use that, I feel like I'm affirming something that's false, then you have to act on your conscience before the Lord. So my basic philosophy is I want to go as far as I can to meet people where they are at without crossing into an unbiblical realm where I'm actually sinning and doing something that's wrong.
Yeah.
Now, exactly where that's at, that's where it takes some wisdom. That's where it takes difficulty. And that's where I think we have to have charity for other Christians. But if Christians just ask the question, how much can I give for charity and respect and love for other people, meeting them in their broken state where they are at while remaining faithful to Scripture? That's the right question that should frame how far we go in making these kinds of accommodations.
Yeah, that's really good. I think you're exactly right. A lot of times we don't want to. It almost feels kind of lazy on our part now that when I think of it this way. But a lot of times we don't want to go and meet people where we can be most helpful. We want them to come and meet us somewhere, right? Like you've got to come and interact with me at a certain level. And obviously you're right. There's a biblical principles and things that we don't want to compromise. But yeah, I think we're typically expecting people to come and meet us, but we're the ones who are pursuing and fishing. So yeah, I like what you said a lot there.
And that's right, by the way. Let me jump in. Jesus didn't just invite people to come to church. And I realized the church hadn't been set up in the way it is today. Mark chapter 2, Jesus is out dining with sinners. He went and met people where they were on their terms, knowing that they were sinners, but they needed the medicine he had to offer first, which is grace, before they could have the power to be changed. That's the model. Let's go meet people on their turf where they are. Invite people to church, great, but let's meet people and build relationships out there. That's what Jesus did.
Yeah, I like that. That's really good. So when this again, this is just constantly putting you on the spot. So when you're engaging in this sort of interaction, what is it that is your goal? What is it that you're shooting for? What do you consider a win in your conversations with people who don't know Christ, and something where you'd walk away from a conversation and think, maybe not feel satisfied, but feel like there was progress made, I guess. I know that Greg Kokel talks a lot about this in his book, Tactics, which I've plugged on this podcast before, where he basically puts it as putting a stone in somebody's shoe. He sort of sees that as a win, where he's getting people to think more deeply about that. What is it that you consider a win when you walk away from a conversation like that?
I consider it a win if I treated the person lovingly and graciously, spoke truth, and advanced the ball, so to speak, towards them coming to know Christ. Now, someone might be on the 2-yard line. Someone might be on the 98-yard line from the other end zone, so to speak. I don't know where somebody's at, but if I can treat somebody lovingly, treat them graciously, somehow speak truth and get them to think about an issue in a way they hadn't, then I feel like that's a success. So I don't gauge success or not whether I convert the person to Christianity, because some people aren't open to it. And some conversations at time, it would be a little bit forced. But you better believe I'm looking for opportunities to go there. And I want that person to walk away and just, like, I think Greg Kokel said it best, a stone in their shoe. Like, gosh, that person was thoughtful, made me think about something differently tied to the gospel that I hadn't before. That's a piece on somebody's journey that God can use ultimately to redeem in their life. So I've had conversations where somebody was just a jerk and they're not open, and I walk away and I'm like, you know what? I treated respectfully. I asked the right question. That was a success. I can't control how they respond. I mean, the rich young ruler walked away from Jesus. So success can't be whether or not someone agrees with us or comes into the kingdom, or Jesus would be a failure. And we all know that's not an option.
Yeah.
But he spoke truth and allowed him to respond in the way that he did.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost seems like this is also sort of connected to what we were talking about earlier, and maybe I'm harshly ascribing laziness into the situation, but it's almost like, and I've been this way too in my discussions with maybe people who disagree with me, or people who aren't followers of Jesus, where it's like I want to accomplish so much in a short amount of time span. We're going to walk away from this conversation and you're going to understand everything perfectly, or you're going to commit your life to Christ or something. And it's almost like I said, this sort of laziness, like I'm only going to dedicate a certain amount of time into this conversation or relationship before I call it quits or call it a failure or something. So I like what you're saying. There's a lot of looking at people as people, and treating relationships as relationships that aren't just to be accomplished, or some goal to be accomplished in this relationship, but a genuine connection and just a true relationship. So thinking of that along the same lines, I've watched a lot of your YouTube videos. I follow your YouTube channel. I've watched a lot of your speaking engagements. And something that is obviously apparent when I watch you interact in these scenarios is the immense amount of humility that you exude in these conversations. And I think humility is probably one of the keys to accomplishing a lot of the things that you've said in engaging in these relationships and being tender in our conversations with people. So can you talk about the focus of humility maybe in your life, and how you can... I don't want to make it seem like give us all of your tips, but you know what I'm saying. Talk about how you facilitate humility in your life in a lot of these difficult conversations, because it can be really easy for us to get emotionally involved and then react a negative way or something.
I'm happy to share any tips that I can. That is not a problem for me. I got to be honest with you, though. When you say, like, what's the key to humility, I feel like I'm not the right person to ask. There are people a lot more humble than I am. And it makes me nervous to be like, hey, Josh, here's 3 things where you can be humble. So I'm honored that it comes across that way. And I can tell you that is my goal. But I just fall short all the time. I guess what I ask myself when it's all said and done is, am I trying to win an argument or am I trying to win a person? And if I'm trying to win an argument, I'm going to make sure I get the last word. I'm going to correct my interlocutor every chance that I get. But if I'm trying to win a person, sometimes I'll let stuff go. I'll try to find common ground. I'll just show charity and assume the best. And if a point stands that I don't respond to, then it stands. It's not about me when it's all said and done. So I guess I feel like in our culture today, it's such an argumentative culture. People are angry and they're defensive and we're quick to attack. And there's something about, when I think of Jesus, he had this firmness and this confidence, but this kindness about him. Like my president Biola, he says, we want to be firm in the center, but soft on the edges. And that's just, all I can say is that's what I try to do. I want to be charitable towards people. I want to be kind towards people. I want them to walk away and go, gosh, he gave me something to think about. But I never want to humiliate somebody. I mean, what good does that do? So I think if we just ask the question, I mean, in some ways, it's as simple as saying, if I'm in a conversation, how do I really love this person? What does it look like to love that person? Because if you're in a debate or even a conversation like this, we're both thinking, I don't want to look bad. I want to do a good job. Like, that's human nature.
Right.
But again, perfect love casts out fear. If we focus on how do I love my audience and how do I love the other person and realize that it's not about me, I think that shift just makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. So I sort of want to cap the conversation with maybe some what you see as would see as recommended action steps that we can take. A lot of us, in my evaluation of a lot of us as Christians, because of a lot of the things we've talked about, refrain from trying to engage with the culture. We might maybe it's motivated by fear, maybe it's motivated by not wanting to have to get into the thick of everything that's going on in culture and that sort of thing. But it is what we're called to do. So what sort of action steps do you think that we could take to sort of begin moving in that direction, even if it's a tiny step in that direction, to not just sit back and watch, but to become participants in the stuff that's going on in our culture and in the conversation. A lot, get out from behind our Facebook accounts and actually do this in the real world in a significant way. Do you have any recommendations about sort of how somebody can start to do that? Because I know a lot of times Christians think it feels forced or inorganic, but I do think there's this sort of step that needs to be taken on our part as followers of Jesus, because it's what we're commanded to do. So yeah.
Well, I think I would ask people this question, and I think you framed it the right way. Rather than looking at how do I engage the culture from the top down, just simply say, how do I better live out my Christian faith today? And let me frame this a different way. So I with a friend of mine, Jay Warner Wallace, who I know you know, a cold case detective, we wrote a book called So the Next Generation Will Know. And it's full of practical things to help parents and teachers and others engage young people. And the last chapter of the book, I said, okay, you might be feeling overwhelmed right now, that there's so many things and ideas you could do. Just take one. Just take one. If it doesn't work, try a second one. If it does, maybe try a second one. Don't let what you can't do prevent you from what you can do. So what is a letter you can write to somebody over this season? And just to show encouragement to somebody? What's a broken relationship that you can maybe try to restore in your family? What's a gift that you can give to somebody, especially during the season? that maybe you haven't given in the past? I mean, I would just encourage your listeners to say, what's one small thing they can do to show the love of Christ to others that maybe they haven't done before? And the key is, what Jim and I say, is not to go start some new program, but to think more strategically about the opportunities that are already right in front of us. So if you just shift your thinking, there'd be different opportunities. Now, this might be a little different than you're talking about, but here's an example I used. My son, he's now 16, but when he was 14, he wanted to see this movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, about the rock band Queen. It was PG-13, had a little sexual content, but I read enough. I'm like, I'm comfortable taking my son and a buddy. And he asked me to take him. I said, I'll take you. Here's the deal. I'll pay for popcorn and everything. If when we're done, we just come back and sit down, I just want to know what you think about it. What did you see? What do you agree with? Just tell me your thoughts. He goes, sure. So we take him and a friend a movie. We come back home and we sit down for 30 minutes. I'm like, what was good in the movie? What'd you enjoy? Did you like the acting? I said, what role did religion play? Did you find any parts of the movie that seemed forced? Did you ever feel preached at? How did the sexual ethic match up with the ethic of Jesus? And we just talked for 30 minutes. Now, what I tried to do, Josh, is here's an opportunity that was already present, spending time with my son at a movie and shifting it for more of a gospel passing on the faith focus. That's what I would encourage your listeners to do. Maybe there's somebody at work who it's like, you know what, there is an opportunity. I'm going to reach out to that person. So I'll tell you, Josh, there's someone in my family for 2 or 3 years has coached my son at a different club level in a sport. And for years we've talked about, let's get together, let's talk about faith. And just, we kept planning it, never happened. And finally I was like, are you kidding me? Here's a guy interested in faith issues. So last week we got on the calendar, sat down, and he's not a believer. And we just sat down and started talking about God for 30 minutes. Gave him a copy of the book, More Than a Carpenter, and we're going to follow up in a couple weeks and meet again. It's just a matter of looking at the opportunities that are there, remembering what matters most, prioritizing them. That's a small difference everybody can make.
Yeah, I really like that. And what you were saying got me thinking too. So a lot of times when we think about, even in the way I just asked the question to you, it was very much from the perspective of like, how do we go out and meet all of this chaos or something like that? But you immediately framed it in such a way it was like, what can I do to display the love of God in our culture, right? Not necessarily maybe meet the
Amen.
chaos, but display the love of God. So yeah, I really, really like that. I'm going to push Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, again, just because it is basically a handbook on how to approach your everyday scenarios in the way that Sean was just talking about. How do we spot those opportunities? How do we take advantage of those opportunities in a way that doesn't feel weird or inappropriate or inorganic or something like that. So again, Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, check it out if you haven't already. Also, again, I'm going to push Sean and Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the most recent edition, right? You said you revised and co-authored with them. Awesome. Well, thank you, Sean, so much for joining me. I wish we could have gotten into a lot more detail about a lot more things, but hey, this is just sort of like an overview, and I think you had a lot of good things to say and good advice for us as Christians. If you are interested in seeing more of these podcasts, you can check them out on the Church Center app if you haven't downloaded, or you can go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, any of the streaming platforms. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.